Webinar, the new innovation engine, unpacking the risks and opportunities of using AI to power innovation. My name is Josh Haslam, director here at Lux Research, and I'm going to be moderating today's session. Presenting today, we have my colleague, Anthony Schiavo. He's the senior director and principal analyst here at Lux Research. Now, throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on your screen, and time permitting, we'll answer all the questions that we can. But if your question doesn't get answered, please do not hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com and we'll respond. And if at any point you experience technical difficulties, such as a frozen screen, easiest thing to do is refresh your browser, check that your internet connection is strong. So with that, I want to jump right into this kind of really high interest presentation today. So Anthony, over to you to talk about the new innovation engine.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Josh, for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for joining me today. I want to start with this. This is a set of Napier's bones. In the 1600s, logarithms were invented. And with logarithms, you can simplify very complex multiplication problems into much easier to solve mathematical addition problems. But then you could take a mechanical calculator like this and calculate up those sums really quickly. So this invention of logarithms and mechanical addition allowed the calculation of the first really accurate star charts. And it's those star charts that played a big role in kicking off the age of exploration, bringing all the good and bad that came along with it. And I think the question is AI sort of a modern day set of Napier's bones? Is this capacity to do math really going to push us into a new era of innovation? So that's the question we'll be exploring today. We're going to do a very quick primer on AI. This is potentially going to be a review for some of y'all, so we're going to go through it quickly. But it's important to make sure we're all on the same page. We'll spend most of our time looking at different case studies in innovation and thinking about what are the capabilities of AI that are being used. And then we'll build a bit of a roadmap with the Lux AI framework and talk about AI in reality in the innovation sector. So first, AI is a probabilistic tool, right? The way ChatGPT works is it predicts the probability of the next word. And there's some randomness baked in, so it doesn't always pick the most probable word. But if you repeat this process multiple times, you can build out sentences and paragraphs. The more advanced LLMs work on a very similar principle, even though they are much more complex in terms of their ability to make these predictions. Secondly, AI can approximate complex functions, right? So if we want to approximate this function on the left, we can use the neural net on the right. And if we make more complex neural net, we can make a more and more accurate approximation of our function. And AI uses data for training, right? If we want to recreate the function on the left, if we use 10,000 examples to train our neural net, we get a pretty bad approximation. If we use 10 million examples, we get quite a good approximation of this. So when you put all this together, our definition of AI is that they're probabilistic programs, they're trained on large amounts of data, and they can replicate the output of complex tasks. Now, I used LLMs, ChatGPT, as an example there. But it's important to recognize that for a lot of applications, AI is still, it's much broader than neural nets and LLMs. And for technical applications, often algorithmic approaches, things like random forests, are still quite common. However, these still meet our definition of AI, right? They're still probabilistic, they're still able to replicate the output of complex tasks, and they still require data in order to train, even though potentially the size of that data set required or the amount of processing power could be totally different orders of magnitude. It's also worth emphasizing that AI may be a black box. It might not be, but it can be a black box in that we don't understand how it works. But that doesn't mean it can't teach us things. When I talked to the CTO of Cabot in 2019, she said that AI increased their understanding because when it predicted something that the scientists didn't understand or didn't mesh with their theories, they went and they hunted it down. That's what scientists do. So using this tool accelerated their understanding. Lastly, AI is very much a way to mediate human labor. It can automate it, fragment it, break it into multiple tasks, de-skill it, and casualize it, reduce the need for training, right? And if the assembly line did this for manual labor, the gig economy apps did this for service labor, then AI has the potential to do this for knowledge labor. All right, so with all of that out of the way, with a shared definition of AI, let's get into innovation. And first, I want to introduce our 5 key capabilities of AI. First is document summation and review. Large language models in particular have the capability to read and summarize large amounts of text. They can also search and retrieve specific pieces of information. And while these are similar, related tasks, they are different, right? Summation really gives you a view of everything, where search and retrieval is really focused on finding a specific piece of information. They're both important, but they're distinct. Third, you can use AI to generate content, code, text, images. This is, of course, pretty famous. We get the term generative AI for a reason, but it's really just one of the things that AI can do. Fourth, AI can serve as a human-machine interface. I think this is really crucial and really under-discussed. But you can use AI by talking to a large language model. You can use it to give commands to another system. This is what's sometimes called agentic AI. We don't have time to get into that today. That would be a whole other hour discussion in and of itself. I'm not a huge fan of the term agentic, but it's very much the case that you can interface with other programs, other software systems through a large language model. And that can be very powerful by reducing the complexity of that interaction, making it easier for people to actually engage with complex software. And lastly, we have the complex systems modeling. This is what we were talking about earlier. You can think of language as a very complex system that's essentially being modeled by a large language model. But all those other algorithmic approaches, everything from materials informatics to bioinformatics to predictive maintenance, these are all tools that essentially model a complex system. So these are the 5 capabilities of AI. And we're going to go through a very basic innovation funnel. And we're going to highlight here where AI is being used, some of the applications that are developing, where it's really transformative and where it's merely incremental, and ultimately talk about what this means for innovation and what the possibilities are for the future. So starting from the very sort of basic R&D, insight stage down through investigation, investment, and potentially even implementation. So starting with that earliest stage, looking at something like in simulation, right? One example would be Preferred Computational Chemistry. So it's a Japanese startup. They have developed a platform that uses a neural net to accelerate density field theory, that these are molecular simulations, right? They claim that this is 100,000 times faster to 20 million times faster. Of course, there is always, I think some question of how widely applicable these neural net-based solutions are, but certainly they demonstrated some very impressive results. I think it's undeniable that AI can really accelerate these types of calculations. What's impactful or really important about this is that not only does it make this a lot cheaper, it really changes how you can use these types of tools. DFT is something that requires supercomputing time and can be very expensive, right? You simply can't brute force simulate every molecule or target sort of atom of interest, right? But when you dramatically drop both the time and the cost of doing so, you actually can. It actually becomes more realistic to not just do the same thing you were doing but more quickly, but actually let's simulate 100,000 different candidates or 1 million candidates, right? So AI's ability to model this complex system, it hasn't just sped up and reduced the cost of this technical simulation approach. it's fundamentally changed how we can use it. And I think you see something relatively similar here, right? With things like trend spotting. Taste-wise is this company that had developed Taste GPT. It's an interesting approach. They're using a lot of big data to analyze essentially consumer preferences and potentially develop new product ideas. It's not really clear how well this analyzes the trends or actually predicts products. But what is clear is that you're able to interact with a much larger data set here than was previously possible. And it's similar, although I think perhaps a little bit further, or maybe a little bit more aggressive than what we're doing with our virtual anthropologist. Here, we're using large language models to apply an anthropological framework and approach to analyzing large amounts of consumer conversation data. Because we're taking these established anthropological techniques and really just applying them through the lens of AI, what it does is it dramatically scales up our ability to analyze these conversations, right? Whether that's to identify consumer needs, validate solutions, surface consumer fears and desires. The capability of AI to evaluate a large data set and process a lot of information is really powerful here. We could do this analysis with human anthropologists. You just couldn't read millions and millions of documents every month. It wasn't viable. So AI here, it's really unlocked new capabilities in this context. Okay, so in this first stage, basic R&D, basic trend identification, right? You can see that AI's capability to really accelerate analysis of large amounts of data is quite impactful, right? It allows you not just to do the things that you were doing much more quickly, but actually to change the way you do your process, right? For example, for many of our clients, it just wasn't possible to do an anthropological analysis at the very early stage of the innovation funnel. It was too expensive, right? It took too much time. But if you can shrink that down to a more reasonable amount of time, you can bring that to the masses. You can bring that to the very early stage of the innovation funnel. Getting a little bit more down into brainstorming, there's a lot of excitement right now around experts. An expert is a large language model that has been specifically trained on a corpus of data, right? This could be, in the case of NVIDIA, an expert on battery materials, right? Or an expert on pharmaceuticals, biologicals. The idea here is that when you give and train these large language models on these specific areas of literature, you can then pair them with other simulation tools and essentially act as a scientist's guide or helper. You can ask the large language model, what should I look at? I'm trying to solve this problem. What are the opportunities? There's a huge amount of sort of complexity at stake here, and you can really use the expert as your guide through that complexity. This is very challenging, though. It's no surprise that NVIDIA is doing this because this requires a lot of data and a lot of processing power to actually subtrain these LLMs. You can also use AI for knowledge management. Here, again, we see LLMs being put to work. In this example, ScienceCo, they partnered with Microsoft, I believe, to launch SciGPT. This is for internal information management, right? And it's trying to answer, in some cases, a very basic question. Has anyone worked on this problem in the past in my company? It seems like a basic question, but I'm sure everyone who has tried to actually figure that out knows that it can be very challenging to actually understand who did what when, who the experts are, where that information is stored, right? So by giving an LLM access to your existing knowledge architecture, your existing data architecture, you can actually enable a much more powerful search and do so in a very natural language type of way, which makes it easier for employees to find this information. And we're doing something fairly similar with Luxor, which is our AI assistant, right? This is a retrieval augmented generation type of system. So we've given a large language model the ability to search and retrieve from our database of research. And for many clients, it's a really nice way to essentially avoid having to search through and maybe read through all of our reports when they just need that one piece of information. This can go in, get it, surface it, and pull it back immediately. It can be really valuable, really quick, really seamless way of getting a piece of information that you need. And it works just as well for a very specific corpus like our research as it does for a very big body of research or body of data like the records and documents produced by a large company like ScienceGo. So here you can see that as we moved from the sort of very most fundamental R&D capabilities into more innovation management, ideation, brainstorming, figuring out what companies have done in the past, we're actually looking at techniques and approaches that are lower impact in terms of their potential, right? Something like experts is very exciting, but it's not quite as transformative as something like the simulation capabilities, where things were really impossible in the past, and now they're much more possible because of the cost savings and the time savings. Going then further into sort of investigation, trying to find the technologies, trying to find the partners. We've seen the proliferation of a lot of academic search tools. I think there's some real opportunities here with contextual or more of an AI-powered semantic search, but there's also some real challenges. The academic literature space is a lot more fragmented. It's quite tricky to get access to all of a complete corpus of academic papers because those journals and publishing entities don't necessarily want to give that up. And you can see here, I used one of these tools, Consensus, and I asked it around do direct payments to individuals experiencing homelessness help reduce that homelessness, right? And it's come to the right answer, which is yes, but it only searched 10 papers. And this is one of the most studied questions in sociology, right? There's a lot more than 10 papers out there. So actually having the underlying data, to really support robust searching is still a major hurdle. And perhaps it's no surprise in that sense that we see a much more accelerated landscape or more mature tools in IP and patenting. In no small part because that patent database exists and is much more easily accessible, right? You have these global offices and you can quite straightforwardly get access to a global database of patents, even through something like Google. So we're already seeing a wide proliferation of search capabilities, not just even in, and sort of going beyond search into like novelty and even into generation, drafting, patent checking, right? It's very exciting, the ability to really spot white space for some of these patents, but it's also potentially a double-edged sword. You can imagine that patent trolls, people who really want to find white space and then fill it with patents, maybe of low or not so meaningful quality, can benefit tremendously from this type of technology. And even if everyone uses these tools in good faith, the ability to write more patents may just overwhelm patent offices. They may not have the resources, to keep up if the number of patent applications doubles because AI has made it a lot cheaper and easier. We also see AI platforms being used in formulation. There's quite an interesting pair-up between Telenova and food pairing. Food pairing has an AI platform that pinpoints combinations of ingredients based on flavor and aroma, right? And sort of defines the potential technical specifications for a formulation. This is one of the problems that AI is really good at, sort of large product optimization. You have a ton of different variables, multi-factor, multi-variable optimization problem. And you can really help use AI to find a specific solution to shorten that timeline to launch. So as we have gotten further and further down, we're still seeing that type of acceleration, right? But not as much of that transformative impact. And lastly, I would just highlight, venture search. It's also being developed. Right now, I think there's a focus on web scraping, right? A lot of companies are using LLMs to produce profiles of companies. There's a number of groups using the sort of LLM contextual search to help identify startups of interest. I think the use here is a bit more incremental, right? The available information on startups was already pretty good, I think. Or in the case of stealth stage startups, non-existent, right? And a more powerful ability to search doesn't really actually help that when the information is either available or just not there at all. So I think in this context, for something like venture search, we're really going to see that the information is going to become, and especially non-public, non-internet-based information is going to take on an even higher premium because the search capability is really going to be quite commoditized, if you will. When we look at this sector across all these different areas, we can see that summary and retrieval are really the most commonly used approaches, right? There's a ton of summary happening in the trends, experts, knowledge management. These all rely on that capability of document summary, of retrieval. Things like modeling and especially interface and generation, they're really not being used yet. So much of what we're doing with AI is really just in this first two capabilities of information management. So what I think this means is, as much as AI is very exciting and potentially very transformative, I think it's those abilities in generation, interface, and modeling that really change how we can work, right? We saw that with the potential simulation examples, really accelerating that, letting us use that in different ways. Even something like generation for patents, really potentially changing how we interface with the patent landscape and those offices. Perhaps not in a good way, but it's certainly transformative, right? And interface potentially allowing non-experts to use much more complex systems. So we're really just scratching the surface of the potential capabilities of AI in innovation in particular. And it's going to take quite some time still. There's still a lot of development that needs to occur. Application development, use case development, even potentially data set development for training to really unlock the full potential. So we're just at the outset of AI's use in innovation. So I've shown you all these tools, right? And there's still a big question, which is, okay, what should we do, right? We're an innovation team. We have a lot of options. There's a lot of tools out there. There's probably a lot of startups coming and pitching products, and every company is putting AI enabled into their marketing. And, Lux is no exception in a very practical sense. What should we actually do about it, right? And that's why we've developed our AI model here at Lux Research. And it's really got two parts. There's the application value model and the application prioritization model. So first, with value, we think about value in two ways. Knowledge value really captures the impact an application has on company performance, on availability of knowledge, its translational value to other parts of the business. Essentially, does getting smarter at this application improve outcomes, right? And then automation value really focuses on labor savings, right? Is the task frequent, standardized, easily sort of accessible, right? Does it take a lot of work? And how central is it to our performance as a company? But it's important to recognize that just because something is valuable doesn't mean it should be a priority. Companies are operating under a lot of real-world constraints. One of those constraints is time to value. Companies need to demonstrate, and innovators need to demonstrate, that their spending is having ROI really in a year or less, and they need metrics that can truly demonstrate that that ROI exists, right? So you need those shared metrics and a clear path to implement quickly. And then there's also risk, right? Or the chance of success. This captures how, what the likelihood of success is and the barriers that you'll face. AI implementation, mismanagement, misalignment, employee rejection. So underneath all these areas, we have a really detailed questionnaire that we've developed, which is sort of helping our clients guide through these different areas. But if you look at innovation areas, you can see that, as you'd expect, they tend to be pretty high on knowledge value, right? So there's a lot of long-term promise here. Things like the simulation capabilities, experts, even knowledge management, formulation development. These all promise a lot of value. You can see how they could really, potentially increase the performance of your company, make you much better at some of the core capabilities. But when you think about the sort of time to value and that risk or likelihood of success metric, these applications tend to do a lot worse, right? Particularly on time to value. In part, that's because these, I think, tend to take a little bit longer to deploy and develop. Certainly something like simulation or experts, those are very challenging to put in progress. You really need a lot of actual computing capability to build those from the ground up. And the tools are not yet fully developed from external partners. But also there's a real lack of KPIs, right? Think about it. If you had the capability to reduce the time and the cost of developing a new catalyst or material candidate or flavor compound to zero, how would that affect your company's bottom line? It's hard a question to answer because often there's a huge number of business processes in between these very basic R&D activities and sales, the dollar value that companies really, really are after, right? So when you think about AI, what executives are going to start with is things that have those clear KPIs and things that have those clear links to business outcomes. And often that means stuff like sales, right? Reducing the time to sale is something that can be done with AI. And more than that, it's something that many CEOs already prioritize in terms of their KPIs. And they already have a clear understanding of how that KPI is linked to a real business outcome. Whereas something like reducing R&D hours, it's much fuzzier, right? Or in the case of something like an expert, do you even have a KPI? So innovation teams, in a realistic sense, they're going to have to leverage the company-wide tools, things like access to ChatGPT for search or for knowledge management, that are going to be rolled out across the companies. Start there, and then build a long-term case for investment in some of these more specialized AI applications. That may not be the most effective approach, and I think some companies that have a very clear vision for the future can actually leapfrog by investing in areas like simulation and experts. But most companies are under a lot of pressure right now. And the reality is innovation teams are probably not going to be a priority for AI development. So it's going to be up to you to make sure that you can really leverage these company-wide tools. So I want to leave you with 3 key takeaways, and then one last final thought after that. The first is that there are a lot of tools proliferating across innovation, right? But we're really just only beginning to leverage the capabilities of AI. For simulation, for interface, right? For generation, there's a lot that we're not doing with AI yet. And it's going to take time, probably years, to really build those capabilities. Secondly, AI tools really bring value by unlocking a deeper understanding of fundamental processes and systems. We've seen that the knowledge value potential for these tools is quite high, whether it's in simulation, even whether it's in search, something like experts. We have the capability to leverage AI to really increase our understanding. But innovation AI, it's going to be the lowest priority for corporate implementation in a lot of cases. And again, like I said, this creates opportunities if you want to try and invest and leapfrog your competitors, but it also creates risks. And I want to leave you with one final example before we open it up for Q&A, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of Q&A. But companies are thinking a lot about the risks of getting AI wrong, failure to implement, right? Chance of success. That's what our metric is based on. And I think that's important, obviously, but it's also true that there are real risks when it comes to getting AI right. When you actually implement AI successfully, you're also creating a lot of risk. I'll give you one example. This is hypothetical, but imagine you're managing a team, right? This is a team of innovation groups. You have maybe 3 to 5 people in each group. They have their own communications with each other, right? And they have documents. Every month they're producing a document that summarizes what they've done and their progress. It's kind of standardized format. You're a busy person, you're a busy innovation leader. So you start to run those documents through AI. Just, you're not evaluating them, you're not changing the decision-making framework that you're doing, and nothing like that. You just need a summary of those documents, right? And that's helpful so that you can go into these meetings and ask better questions, be a little bit sharper, right? So you put this monthly status report into AI. It spits out a couple questions for you to ask. It tells you how the teams are doing, right? It brings that information to you. And it works. You're able to ask sharper questions because you've got this assistant that's really able to thoroughly read these documents. What do you think your teams are going to start doing once they learn that you're putting their documents into ChatGPT? The answer is obvious, right? They're going to want to know what questions you're going to ask them. So they're going to start putting your documents into ChatGPT. And they're going to start modifying those documents based on the feedback they get, right? So all of a sudden here, what's happened is that you've created a feedback loop. You've inserted this AI, this LLM, into your process. And you don't necessarily know what the preferences of that LLM are, right? Maybe the LLM really wants to get customer testimonials. It thinks that that's really important to establishing the value of whatever innovation you're developing. And it asks questions about customer testimonials when you give it those status reports. Your team, expecting that you're going to ask these questions, goes out and starts to get more customer testimonials. Maybe this is good, right? Maybe this is a really solid way of increasing your product market fit. Maybe this is a waste of time. But either way, it isn't a choice that you've consciously made. You never sat down and said, oh, I'm going to ask my team to do more testimonials. You just said, I'm busy, I'm going to save a little time, or just maybe be better prepared, right, by using AI. But by introducing AI into your system, you've created a feedback loop, and you've given the AI an ability to express its own preferences that you don't understand and that you don't control, and that maybe could change as the models get updated or changed. And so you've created risk. And more to the point, you've sacrificed a little bit of that control. So I just gave you this example. And as much as this is a hypothetical, I know this is something that's happening across a lot of companies. I've talked to a lot of clients, and I know people are using AI in exactly this way. And I know their teams are beginning to respond in exactly this way as well. As this happens, you need to think of the risks, and you need to be aware of them. And that's why you need an AI strategy and an AI application approach, right? To really consider every use case of what you're doing. So I encourage you to download our application selection guide. We have the QR code for it here. This will take you to our website, and you can download that full document there. And if you're interested, get in touch and we can have a deeper discussion. But Josh, I'm happy to open up for questions now. I'll leave the QR code up for a little bit longer. But before we do, I'll just say thanks to everyone in the audience for listening, and we hope you found it enjoyed the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. Let's leave up the QR code here for the rest of our discussion, just so people can access it as we go in. But again, we're going to be transitioning now to our question section. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. And again, if we don't get them today, don't worry, we will get back to you in the short term. But let me just take a look at what we have here. And I think you've talked a lot about ideas around AI, strategies. You said some folks are beginning to use this in more complicated ways that are integral to innovation and monitoring and checking on innovation. But if we think quite more broadly, what's the current state of readiness as corporates develop AI? Where are we? How norm is what you brought up versus what's the variance here as far as where we sit today in applying it well and seeing those types of results that you were bringing up as hypotheticals?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think the use of AI is far outstripping AI strategy at this point.
Yeah.
Almost everyone I've talked to has said, yeah, we have ChatGPT at work. A lot of companies I've talked to have like, oh, we've done some fragmented deployments. We've got individual projects going on, and some of those date back years, right? AI is this hype thing now, but a lot of early work on AI and formulation development of food,
Absolutely.
materials, all that good stuff dates back, as much as a decade, right? But as much as it's very common for people to be using AI, it's quite rare. I'd say the minority, maybe 20% or less, have a corporate AI strategy, or at least know that there's a corporate AI strategy. And when I ask people who is responsible for AI or AI strategy at your company, routinely I just don't get an answer, or I get like, oh, well, there's like 5 or 6 people, or like, oh, we have our IT group is actually aligned to our different business segments. So each business segment has an IT person who's developing use cases for AI. And it's like, okay, there's really not a very comprehensive corporate strategy.
It's very decentralized still.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Even
even
though
though
the
you might
use,
have a couple efforts, it is decentralized, and
yeah,
maybe the
and
wrong
most
folks are even
companies,
leading it.
yeah, and most companies really do have, I think, at this point, access to ChatGPT or something like it, and they're really not thinking about how that's changing how they operate.
Yeah. Yeah. So lots of different steps here. And I just want to again note we're sort of out of time for today's discussion, but I think some of the questions you brought up as we've discussed internally, you'll be able to dive in a little bit deeper if you do download this QR code. It gives you some really good ideas on where to ask those questions, where to begin to ask. And of course, we have Anthony to ask or answer any of those questions, build feedback, and begin hopefully to create your own feedback loops with AI, and see some success with this as you move forward. So I just want to end us here and say again, thanks, Anthony. This is a great webinar. I really think that we're again on the edge of things, and as you pointed out, what are the risks? What are the rewards? Really important to begin to consider both of these as we do this. But just for all those who have attended today, the slide presentation is going to be made available. So don't worry about that. Same with the recording, and they'll all be sent to all attendees who had access today. And then lastly, of course, after leaving the webinar, we always prompt you to complete a survey on today's webinar. It's really important for us. That feedback helps us to inform what our future webinars are for the world. And so please take a moment, check that out. And lastly, of course, we do have upcoming webinars for you, so you can find them either on our Lux LMS slide or within this webinar itself. So thanks again for joining us, and have a great day.